We begin this hour with what may be Donald Trump's most overarching attempt at wielding the powers of the Justice Department to enact his retribution, not only on his perceived enemies, but also the highest levels of the Obama administration. On Friday, a federal grand jury in Florida approved about 30 subpoenas in a Justice Department investigation linked to the probes by the CIA and FBI into Russian interference in the 2016 election. Now, that's according to a source familiar with the matter. They investigated not once, but twice, folks. Once by the Trump-appointed special counsel John Durham, and also by then Senator Marco Rubio as chairman of the Senate Select Committee. Now, he has like 15 jobs in this current administration, singing a different tune. And in both cases, there was no criminal evidence found to charge Brennan, who we should note is an MSNBC analyst.
Okay, so Washington, D.C. just exploded in absolute chaos. Congress held an emergency session, and what they did is unprecedented. Democrats and Republicans came together in a rare bipartisan coalition to block what they're calling Trump's silent coup, his systematic attempt to seize power through executive orders, emergency declarations, and blatant violations of congressional authority. This isn't normal partisan fighting. This is both parties recognizing that Trump has gone too far, that he's trying to rule by decree, that he's erasing constitutional checks and balances, and Congress just said no. They passed emergency reforms. They stripped Trump of key powers. They made it a criminal offense for executive officials to violate congressional authority. And D.C. is in chaos because nobody saw this coming. Nobody expected Republicans to break with Trump. Nobody thought Congress could move this fast or this decisively. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
He understands it, is also looking at the FBI's Crossfire Hurricane probe, which, as you guys might remember, looked at whether people associated with Trump's 2016 campaign coordinated with Russia. And it is also looking at special counsel Jack Smith's cases against Trump. Now, if you're confused and you're asking, how does this 9-year-old CIA assessment of Russian interference in our election connects to the investigation of Trump taking classified documents to Mar-a-Lago after he left the White House?
Yeah, what is that?
Well, the theory feeds into the nearly decade-long conspiracy theory pushed by Trump and those on the far right. The Democrats and this deep state that doesn't exist have been perpetuating an ongoing conspiracy to violate Trump's civil rights by falsely portraying him as a tool of Russia in waging lawfare war against him. Lawfare against him, no war. Join us now, Christy Greenberg, MSNBC legal analyst, former federal prosecutor, and host of Courtside with Christy Greenberg on YouTube, and Michael Feinberg, the MSNBC national security and intelligence analyst and former assistant special agent in charge with the FBI. Christy, I want to start with you. First, though, I'm going to play some sound. This is our producer, Jonathan Hellman. I always ask this for these blocks because I love it, because I think it tells you everything you need to know about this administration. This sound from Ed Martin, the head of...
The Senate vote tells you everything, 52 to 48. That means Republicans crossed party lines to vote against Trump, to limit his powers, to protect congressional authority. That's extraordinary, because Trump still controls the Republican Party, still has enormous influence, still can end political careers with a single Truth Social post. But enough Republicans decided that Trump's power grabs were too dangerous, that protecting the Constitution mattered more than party loyalty, and they voted with Democrats to rein him in. The specific reforms Congress passed are devastating to Trump's agenda. First, they abolished Trump's tariff powers. Trump has been using emergency declarations to impose tariffs without congressional approval, claiming national security threats that don't actually exist, using trade policy as a political weapon. Congress just ended that. They passed legislation that strips away Trump's ability to impose tariffs through emergency declarations. Now he needs congressional authorization, which he's not going to get. That kills a huge part of Trump's economic agenda. Second, Congress reformed the Impoundment Control Act, made it a criminal offense for executive officials to redirect or withhold congressionally appropriated funds. This is huge, because Trump has been refusing to spend money that Congress appropriated, withholding funds from programs he doesn't like, using the budget as leverage to force policy changes, and Congress just made that illegal. not just against the rules, actually criminal. Executive officials who violate this new law face automatic penalties, maybe even prison time. That's Congress sending the strongest possible message. You don't get to override our spending decisions. You don't get to refuse to execute the laws we pass. And if you try, you're committing a crime. Third, Congress passed new war powers resolutions, requiring explicit congressional authorization for any major military action lasting more than 30 days. This ends decades of presidents launching wars without congressional approval. Trump has been threatening military action in multiple places, using the military for domestic enforcement, deploying troops without congressional authorization. And Congress just said, no more. You want to go to war? You need our approval. You want to deploy troops for extended operations? Come ask Congress first, and if you don't, we'll cut funding and start impeachment proceedings. The bipartisan nature of this is what makes it historic. Both parties' leaders publicly condemned Trump, called his actions an obvious attempt to rule by decree, said he's trying to erase constitutional checks and balances. Even Trump's GOP allies acknowledged that these powers could be used by any future president, that if they let Trump get away with this, they're setting precedents that a Democratic president could use against them. So they decided to act now to limit executive power before it's too late, to preserve the constitutional system before Trump destroys it. Congressional leaders are using must-pass bills to force these reforms through attaching them to spending packages that have to be approved to keep the government running. That means Trump loyalists can't just vote against the reforms, because voting against the spending bill would shut down the government, would create a crisis that Republicans would get blamed for. So the reforms are going to pass. They're going to become law, and Trump is going to lose huge amounts of power. The chaos in D.C. reflects the magnitude of what just happened, because this is Congress asserting itself in ways it hasn't done in decades, taking back powers that have gradually shifted to the executive branch, drawing clear lines about what presidents can and cannot do, and doing it in defiance of a president who demands absolute loyalty. The media is covering this as a constitutional crisis, as Congress and the presidency in direct conflict, as the legislative branch finally pushing back against decades of executive overreach. And they're right, this is one of the most significant assertions of congressional power in modern American history. Trump's response has been predictably furious. He's calling this a coup, saying Congress is trying to overthrow him, threatening vetoes and legal challenges, but Congress has the votes. They can override vetoes if they stay united. And the legal challenges are going to fail because Congress is operating well within its constitutional authority. The Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate commerce, to appropriate funds, to declare war. Congress is just reclaiming those powers from a president who's been usurping them. The connection to Project 2025 is significant because that's Trump's plan to expand presidential control over the bureaucracy, to turn every federal agency into a tool for implementing Trump's agenda. And Congress saw that plan, understood what it would mean, and decided to act before Trump could implement it, before he could consolidate so much power that Congress couldn't stop him. This is Congress preventing the silent coup before it succeeds. All right, so let's dig into exactly what Trump's silent coup was, how Congress is blocking it, and why this represents such a fundamental shift in the balance of power. Trump's silent coup wasn't a violent overthrow, wasn't troops in the streets or suspension of elections. It was much more subtle. Much more insidious, it was Trump systematically accumulating powers that the Constitution gives to Congress, using emergency declarations to bypass legislative approval, using executive orders to override congressional statutes, using control over the bureaucracy to prevent execution of laws he disagrees with. All of it technically legal-looking, all of it wrapped in justifications about efficiency and national security, but all of it fundamentally undermining the constitutional system of separated powers. The tariff issue is a perfect example. The Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate commerce. That includes setting tariffs. Trade policy is supposed to be made by the legislative branch. But over decades, Congress has delegated some of that authority to the president for emergencies, gave presidents the ability to impose tariffs quickly when genuine national security threats emerge. Trump has been abusing that delegated authority, declaring fake emergencies, claiming that imports from Brazil or Canada or Mexico threaten national security, using those false declarations to impose tariffs that are really about politics or economics, not security. And because he's operating under delegated emergency powers, He doesn't need congressional approval. Congress saw what Trump was doing, recognized it as abuse of the emergency powers they'd granted, and now they're taking those powers back. The October 29th Senate vote abolished Trump's ability to use emergency declarations for tariffs. That 52-48 vote included at least 3 Republican senators breaking with Trump voting to limit his powers because they recognized the danger of letting any president impose tariffs without congressional oversight. The Impoundment Control Act reforms are even more significant because they address Trump's refusal to spend money Congress has appropriated. Here's how it works normally. Congress passes a budget, appropriates money for specific purposes, and the president executes those appropriations, spends the money as Congress directed. That's basic separation of powers. Congress controls the purse. The president executes Congress's spending decisions, but Trump has been refusing to spend appropriated funds, claiming he has discretion over when and how to execute congressional appropriations, withholding money from programs he doesn't like, using the threat of withholding funds to pressure states and institutions. That's called impoundment, and it's illegal. Congress passed the Impoundment Control Act in the 1970s, specifically to prevent presidents from refusing to spend appropriated funds. But enforcement has been weak. Presidents have been able to delay spending or refuse to spend with minimal consequences. Congress just changed that, made impoundment a criminal offense. Any executive official who redirects or withholds congressionally appropriated funds is now committing a crime subject to automatic penalties. This isn't civil enforcement anymore, this is criminal law. Do this and you go to jail. That's the strongest possible deterrent. And it reflects Congress being absolutely done with Trump's refusal to execute the laws they pass. The War Powers resolutions address another major area of executive overreach. The Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war, but presidents have been launching military actions without congressional declarations for decades. Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. All wars or major military operations conducted without formal congressional declarations. Presidents claim they have inherent authority as commander-in-chief, or they rely on broad authorizations that Congress passed decades ago and that were meant for specific conflicts. Trump has been pushing those boundaries even further, using military forces for domestic law enforcement, deploying troops to the border, threatening military action against various countries, all without seeking congressional authorization. Congress just ended that. Passed resolutions requiring explicit congressional approval for any military action lasting more than 30 days. That's a clear line. You can respond to immediate threats without asking permission. But if you want to conduct sustained military operations, you need to come to Congress, you need to make your case, you need to get authorization, and if you don't, Congress will cut off funding and consider impeachment. The bipartisan nature of this pushback is what makes it historic, because normally, Congress divides along partisan lines. The president's party defends him. The opposition attacks, and nothing gets done. But this is different. Republicans are joining Democrats to limit Trump's powers. Not because they disagree with his policies necessarily, but because they recognize that the powers he's claiming could be used by future presidents, including Democratic presidents. If they let Trump withhold appropriated funds, then a Democratic president could withhold defense spending. If they let Trump impose tariffs through emergency declarations, then a Democratic president could declare a climate emergency and impose massive carbon tariffs. Republicans are thinking long-term. They're protecting congressional authority not just against Trump, but against whoever comes next. That strategic thinking is what enabled this bipartisan coalition to form. The specific language from congressional leaders is telling. They called Trump's actions an obvious attempt to rule by decree and erase constitutional checks. That's not normal political rhetoric. That's Congress formally accusing the president of trying to overthrow the constitutional system, of attempting a coup through legal mechanisms rather than violence, and both parties are saying it. Democratic leaders and Republican leaders using the same language, reaching the same conclusions, that Trump has gone too far and must be stopped. The connection to Supreme Court cases is important, because Trump has been pushing the boundaries of executive power, expecting that the Supreme Court will eventually back him, that conservative justices will defer to presidential authority, that he'll get favorable rulings that expand executive power even further. But Congress is acting before those Supreme Court decisions come down. They're passing legislation that limits executive power regardless of what courts say, because Congress has clear constitutional authority to regulate commerce, to appropriate funds, to declare war. Courts can't override that authority. So even if the Supreme Court wanted to help Trump, They couldn't stop Congress from reclaiming these powers. The speed of congressional action is also remarkable. These reforms were introduced, debated, and passed in a matter of weeks, not months or years. Congress moved with unprecedented urgency because they recognized the threat, saw that Trump was systematically accumulating power, and decided they needed to act immediately before he consolidated too much control. The use of must-pass bills is a clever legislative strategy because Congress needs to pass spending bills regularly to keep the government running. Those bills are going to pass no matter what. So attaching the reform provisions to those must-pass bills ensures the reforms get enacted. Trump loyalists can't vote against the reforms without voting to shut down the government, and they're not willing to do that. So the reforms pass. Project 2025 was the wake-up call for many Republicans. That's Trump's plan to expand presidential control over the bureaucracy, to fire career civil servants and replace them with political appointees, to turn every federal agency into an arm of the president's political operation. Republicans looked at that plan and realized what it would mean. A Democratic president with that level of control over the bureaucracy could use federal agencies to advance progressive policies without congressional approval, could use the IRS to target conservative organizations, could use environmental agencies to shut down industries, could use the Justice Department to prosecute political opponents. That's what motivated many Republicans to join this effort. They're not just limiting Trump's power, they're preventing future presidents from having that power too. The chaos in D.C. reflects the disruption this causes. Executive branch officials don't know how to operate under these new constraints. They're scrambling to figure out what they can still do and what's now prohibited. Congressional staffs are overwhelmed with implementing the new legislation. Lobbyists and interest groups are trying to understand how this changes the political landscape. It's a fundamental reshuffling of power, and it's creating chaos as everyone adjusts. Okay, so let's break down what this congressional action means for Trump's presidency, for the balance of power, and for American democracy. Point 1. Congress stripping Trump of tariff powers fundamentally undermines his economic agenda and his ability to use trade policy as a political weapon. Trump has made tariffs central to his presidency. He sees them as tools for reshaping global trade relationships, for punishing countries he doesn't like, for rewarding allies. And he's been imposing them unilaterally using emergency powers. Congress just ended that. Now Trump needs congressional approval for new tariffs. And Congress isn't going to give it because most economists think Trump's tariffs are harmful. They raise prices for consumers. They hurt American businesses. They create retaliatory tariffs that damage exports. Congress has no interest in authorizing more tariffs. So this reform effectively ends Trump's tariff agenda. He can't impose new ones. And existing ones might be rolled back through legislation. That's a huge policy defeat. Point 2. Making impoundment a criminal offense creates personal, legal jeopardy for any executive official who tries to withhold appropriated funds. This isn't just about Trump. This is about every cabinet secretary, every agency head, every White House official involved in budget decisions. They all now face potential criminal prosecution if they refuse to spend money Congress has appropriated. That creates enormous incentive for compliance, because even if Trump orders them to withhold funds, they personally face prison time if they do it. Most officials aren't willing to go to jail for Trump, so they'll comply with congressional appropriations, even if Trump wants them to withhold funding. That makes Trump's threats to withhold funding meaningless, because the people who would have to execute those threats are now personally liable. Point 3. War powers resolutions requiring congressional authorization and Trump's ability to use military force as a unilateral political tool. Trump has been threatening military action constantly against Iran, against Mexico, against various terrorist groups, using the military for domestic immigration enforcement, all without seeking congressional approval. These new resolutions force him to get approval, or face immediate funding cuts and potential impeachment. Congress is making clear that unauthorized military action will result in the most severe constitutional consequences that changes Trump's calculus. He can't just launch military operations expecting Congress to support them after the fact. He has to build congressional support first, and if he can't, then the operations don't happen. Point 4. Bipartisan support for these reforms proves that concerns about executive overreach transcend partisan politics when the threat becomes serious enough. This is remarkable. In our hyperpartisan era, getting both parties to agree on anything is nearly impossible. But the threat of Trump's silent coup was severe enough that Republicans broke with their own president, sided with Democrats to protect congressional authority. That shows the reforms aren't just political theater, they're genuine constitutional protection, supported by legislators who understand the long-term implications of unchecked executive power. That bipartisan support also makes the reforms much harder to repeal. Even if Trump wanted to pressure Congress to reverse these changes, he'd need to flip Republicans who've already demonstrated willingness to vote against him. That's very difficult. Point 5. This congressional action establishes new precedents for legislative resistance to executive overreach that will constrain future presidents. These reforms don't just apply to Trump. They establish new legal frameworks that all future presidents must operate within. The tariff restrictions, the criminalization of impoundment, the war powers requirements, all of these create legal constraints that last beyond Trump's presidency. Future presidents will have less ability to accumulate unilateral power, will face stronger congressional oversight, will operate under stricter legal limits. That's good for democracy. That's the constitutional system of checks and balances working as designed. So what's the bottom line? Congress just destroyed Trump's silent coup, his systematic attempt to accumulate executive power through emergencies, executive orders, and control over bureaucracy. They did it through rare bipartisan action. Republicans and Democrats voting together to strip Trump of key powers. The Senate passed reforms abolishing Trump's tariff powers, making impoundment a criminal offense, requiring congressional authorization for military action, all designed to reclaim congressional authority that Trump has been usurping. The 52-48 vote shows Republicans breaking with Trump, recognizing that his power grabs threaten the constitutional system and voting to limit him even though it will provoke his fury. That bipartisan coalition is historic, shows that concerns about executive overreach can overcome partisan divisions when the threat is severe enough. The chaos in D.C. reflects the magnitude of this shift. Congress hasn't asserted itself this forcefully in decades. The executive branch doesn't know how to operate under these new constraints. Everyone is scrambling to adjust to the new balance of power. Trump is furious, calling this a coup, threatening legal challenges. But Congress has the constitutional authority, the votes to override vetoes, and the determination to preserve the separation of powers. The connection to Project 2025 motivated many Republicans. They saw Trump's plan to expand control over bureaucracy, realized what that level of presidential power could mean, and decided to act before it was too late. This isn't just about stopping Trump, it's about preventing future presidents from having dangerous levels of unilateral power. These reforms establish new precedents, create new legal frameworks, build stronger checks on executive authority. They'll constrain not just Trump, but every president who comes after. That's the lasting significance. Congress isn't just blocking Trump's current agenda. They're reshaping the presidency for generations, restoring the balance of power that the Constitution intended, proving that legislative authority can still check executive overreach when Congress has the courage to act. This is democracy defending itself, the constitutional system working as designed. Separated powers checking each other, Congress refusing to let the president rule by decree. It's messy, it's chaotic, but it's what's supposed to happen when one branch accumulates too much power. And it's happening now. Trump's silent coup has been crushed. His systematic power grabs have been blocked. His ability to bypass Congress has been eliminated. And D.C. is in chaos as everyone adjusts to this new reality. This is what congressional resistance looks like when it's serious. When it's bipartisan, when it's determined to preserve the Constitution. Trump tried to accumulate unchecked power, and Congress just said no.